Do you ever get the sense that the world is just kind of falling apart? That things are worse than they've ever been, and that basically we're screwed and there's no way back? Do you ever feel that way? Most of the conversations that I have with people when it comes to, how the world is doing, how our country, how our state is doing, definitely focus on the negative. It revolves around this idea that everything is just getting so much worse than what it was back in the good old days, back when we were growing up, and things were a lot less chaotic and scary and a little easier when we were young. That somehow with all of the advances that we have made in a myriad of areas over the last 100 years, somehow the world is just going to hell in a handbasket, and there's nothing that we can do about it. And we should all be angry, and we should all be terrified. That's just kind of the sentiment that you get when you talk to people about current events and what's going on in the world. In fact, today, while I was prepping for my message tonight, I got a text from a friend. We were kind of texting back and forth between some stuff, and then he texted me this. Quote, "Hey, complete random side note. Is it wrong to think that the most fitting song right now is REM's It's the End of the World as We Know It? It just started playing on the radio and it seemed fitting." Now, I'm assuming that he was kind of joking when he sent that to me, but it speaks to this deep feeling that a lot of people have that things are just terrible and they're only going to get worse. Even before COVID, in the before times, when I would talk to people about what was going on in their lives, things seemed usually pretty decent, but anything outside of their lives and everything was just going horrible. And it wasn't even necessarily based on this incredibly divided political situation that we find ourselves in. That is very sinful and will destroy us if we're not careful. It was outside of politics. It was just everything else, although, that obviously played a little role in it. The media, right? Technology, the education system that we find our kids in, healthcare, violence, the housing crisis, climate change, the economy, societal changes. Everything is just moving in the wrong direction. You get that sense? What if I told you that you shouldn't believe everything that you see, and that you shouldn't believe everything that you hear? What if the world isn't actually falling apart? And what if things are better now than they have ever been in the entirety of human history on almost every single measurable scale? What if that was the case? That'd be some real good news, wouldn't it? Tonight, I'm going to start this short little series that we're going to walk through called Real Good News. And the chances that you're going to listen to everything that I have to say or remember anything that I have to say are definitely not in my favor, because of something that I talked about a couple of weeks ago that has to do with our natural tendency to pay far more attention to negative things, bad news, than our tendency to pay attention to good news. We have this thing called the natural negative bias, this bent that we all have towards paying an extreme amount of attention to bad news and not paying attention to good news. You'll notice this anytime somebody gives you any sort of critical feedback. Maybe they've critiqued you on something you said or something you've done or something you're wearing, and you will just allow that thing to eat inside of your head for weeks. But if somebody compliments you on your shoes or your hair or that brilliant sermon you gave last week, hey, thanks, appreciate it, and you will never think of it again. That it takes 10 times more compliments to equal the single effectiveness of one critical thought. It's a weird, fascinating thing that is just seemingly hardwired into humans. Now, everybody has a little bit different extreme in that, but for the majority of us, bad news sticks with us, and it is highlighted at the most extreme levels. Fear, anger, worry, bitterness, rage, outrage, anxiety, all of these things constantly find their way into our heads. You see them when you scroll through social media or when you open up the news app on your phone, don't you? Every single story seems to be something that's designed to scare you or make you mad, because that's just the world we live in. They lead the headlines of every single newspaper, every single magazine. They own the top of the hour in every single news broadcast that you've probably watched since you were a little kid, even back in the good old days when things were a lot more simple. What once was a fantastic asset for humanity, the ability for us to notice and to recognize and to pay attention to things that were dangerous, things that should terrify us, things that should make us angry, injustices. That was a huge tool for humanity. But it's become a very dangerous addiction for us, especially with the rapid pace that we are given information nowadays. And what once was very helpful for us when it came to survival in a very dangerous and brutal world has now led to toxic levels of rage and fear. In fact, there's new terms that have been coined because of what we're now seeing, what psychologists are now dealing with on a regular basis. Outrage porn and doom scrolling. You may have found yourself in the middle of these terms without actually realizing what you are doing. Doom scrolling is when you're trying to fall asleep and yet you keep finding yourself scrolling through Facebook, usually Facebook, sometimes Twitter, usually Facebook, not usually Instagram, but Facebook. Did I mention that it was usually Facebook? You constantly are scrolling, not to see what people are up to, but to find something that just outrages you because it gives you a little bit of a jolt. Outrage porn. This weird thing where we get a little bit of pleasure by being angry. And the more that we can find just little things that anger us, the better we feel about ourselves, the more self-righteous we are because those people are doing bad stuff and I don't have to worry about what's going on in my own life. Odd and catchy terms, right? Doom scrolling and outrage porn. The problem is that we're currently reaping the reality of this as this world that we currently live in right now is looking into the future at what it's going to be like as we glimpse the oncoming end of this COVID pandemic. As that slowly comes into view, what we're seeing is people are having a really hard time getting back into normal because of the amount of fear and anxiety that has just been fed to us like candy. The New York Times published an article 2 weeks ago that I read, and it was really eye-opening for me. The article was entitled "Bad News Bias," and it was written by David Leonhardt. And what he did is he covered the research of a Dartmouth professor on the negative bias in COVID reporting. Not just all reporting, but COVID-specific reporting, both on the local level, on the international level, and then on the national level. I'm going to read a couple of quotes from this article because it was very helpful for me. Here's the first one. Quote, "The coverage by U.S. publications with a national audience, not your local news and not international stuff, but national news, has been much more negative than coverage by any other source that the researchers analyzed, including scientific journals, major international publications, and regional or local U.S. media. Quote, "The most well-read U.S. media are outliers in terms of their negativity," Molly Cook, a co-author of this study, told me. About 87% of the COVID coverage in national U.S. media last year was negative. The other shares, 51% was negative in international media, 53% in local and regional news, and 64% was negative in scientific journals. Do you see that difference? 87% negative in national news, but 51% negative in international media. That's a huge spike. That's 36% more negative on the news that most of us watch. And it didn't matter what side of the political spectrum you were watching. MSNBC and Fox News were specifically called out in their research for being hyper negative when it came to COVID. Now, they found that these stories that these national media sources would focus on dwelled on anything that they could find that was negative, and they would purposely ignore or mislead on good news when it came to COVID stuff. They would purposely brush aside anything that was uplifting or joyful or would give you hope, and they would focus and spend additional time on negative stuff. Now, not that COVID isn't scary and it hasn't killed a lot of people, and not that it isn't something that we should take very seriously, but the amount of skewing that was done has now forced us into a position that we weren't expecting when this thing started. Not that we were expecting any of this. So, after some continual research and digging as to find out why this was the case, the New York Times article found a single reason, and then the author of this article gave his own perspective, which I found very helpful. The researchers found that the data indicates that the stories that we consume the most, the things that we go out and look for, the things that we share on Facebook or social media, the things that you talk about when you're with your friends or your family, the things that you click on, the things that you buy, the things that you watch, the things that you ingest into your mental system are predominantly and almost always negative. Interesting, right? To quote this article again, to put it another way, the stories that people choose to read skew even more negatively than the stories that the media organizations have been choosing to publish. Quote, human beings, particularly consumers of major media, like negativity in their stories. We think the major media are only responding to consumer demand. To put it succinctly, we demand it, and so they're supplying it. The number one goal of mass media and social media is not necessarily to present you with good, clear, factual stories. Their number one job is to make money. That's their bottom line. And if you're going to be buying it, then they're going to be selling it. And you've probably heard of several of the axioms that guide the media's constant and continual quest for more eyeballs and therefore more revenue. The number one thing, sex sells. It does. A little bit of a shift from the whole COVID thing. I know you weren't prepared for it, but I'm going to take you on a little fun ride. We all know that sex sells. It's just reality. That's how the swimsuit edition of Sports Illustrated got started. Like, what? They have nothing to do except for it sold a ton of magazines and a lot of subscriptions. We've all probably seen the Carl's Jr. commercials, right? Beautiful women in the most tiny bikinis, eating the messiest burgers you've ever seen in your entire life. Makes no sense, but it has sold millions of burgers. Carl's Jr. went from a struggling franchise to exploding in growth when they started putting out these commercials. It doesn't make sense, but it works. It's just the reality of marketing to human beings. In fact, their commercials have gotten so racy that the entire country of New Zealand has banned their commercial promoting the Memphis barbecue burger because it was, quote, sexually explicit. Advertising for a Memphis barbecue burger. And no, I did not watch the ad, just to make sure. We all know that this is ridiculous, but we also know that it works. And when it comes to Christianity and Christians, we know that we're not supposed to be buying sex. We do that in the privacy of our own home when nobody's watching, and we pretend like that's not a thing, but that's a sermon for another time. We know that we're not supposed to buy sex, but you know what we do buy? A lot of, a truckload of fear and anger. We will buy that like it's going out of style, like we are literally addicted to it because we are. It is our crack cocaine. And that's where we see the second axiom of the media empires come into play. If it bleeds, it leads. Anything that is scary, anything that's going to cause you anxiety, will be placed front and center all the time. Over anything else, over that nice puppy story, it's going to get pushed to the back. Probably not even going to make it on. It doesn't matter if you should be scared by this. It just needs to be able to scare you. It could be something that's completely mundane, but if they can make it sound scary, then they will sell it to you. And it works every time. I remember growing up as a kid and we had one TV in the house, and when I was old enough to watch primetime television, I remember all of the local news channels would always have on those little blurbs in between the other commercials, and they would say the dumbest stuff. Things like, 5 household items that could kill your pets tonight at 11. And you're like, wait, what? 7 things you don't know cause cancer tonight at 10 o'clock. 8 things every pet owner should fear tonight, only on News Channel 8. And the funny thing about those, if you did end up staying up and watching the nightly news, they were always the same things, and they were all things that you already knew that would kill your kids. They can drown themselves in toilet water. You should probably not allow your toddler to swim in the toilet. Don't let your kids drink bleach. You probably shouldn't feed your children toilet bowl cleaner. It's very bad for them. But it didn't matter if it was stuff that you should actually be fearful of or new information that you needed. All they wanted was your eyeballs so that they could sell more advertising, because their number one goal is to make money, not inform you. And so as I was growing up, I learned very quickly that the nightly news was worthless because they didn't actually give me anything that was interesting, because I had already gotten my Nintendo Power magazine earlier in the month, and I knew all of the news that was relevant to me. The funny thing is, what we used to notice every night during prime time, and these dumb little teases for the nightly news, have now become things that we see all the time, multiple times a minute on our phones as we're scrolling through either your news app or Facebook or any of this stuff. They're BuzzFeed headlines, things that are meant and designed to grab your attention. And you know when you click on that, quiz that's going to tell you what royal family member you're related to, really is completely worthless. But its job is to sell advertising so that they can make money. It's called an EMV, an emotional marketing value that they can put on a headline, and they can scientifically, it's a very weird thing, I did some research this week into it, they can scientifically analyze different headlines, and then they score them based on the words that they are using that most efficiently and effectively create an emotional trigger in the reader, causing them to have a deep emotional action and therefore far more likely to act physically, to either click on, watch, or purchase a product. The increasing likelihood of sharing that article, of talking to your friends or your neighbors about that news story so that then they watch the next night's news or buy the product, that's their goal. CopyPress is a company that specializes in EMV, this emotional marketing value. And in their pitch on their website when they're trying to sell you their services to make your headlines and your articles far more catchy. This is how they end their sales pitch. This is the last paragraph on their website. Quote, "Don't think of scare tactics that lure readers into an article as manipulative or unethical. Instead, think about the headline as an opportunity to grab the reader's attention, empathize with their emotions, and then present them with a solution to alleviate their fears." But the reality is, it is manipulation, and it is happening on a global scale. I want you to try something tonight, or right now, because you're bored. But sometime tonight, before you go to sleep, I want you to grab your phone, because it's probably going to be in your hand anyway. I want you to open up either your favorite social media app or your news app, wherever you like to get your news, website or whatever, and start scrolling through. And I want you to be looking for things that are specifically designed to make you afraid or make you angry. My bet is over 80% of everything that you're going to see, including the advertisements, are going to fall into those two categories. The third category is sex, but you're a Christian, so you're not going to mess with that, right? You will notice how many of them are trying to scare you. How many of them are trying to make you angry, trying to blame somebody else on the other team, because they know what team you're on, because they have algorithms that know exactly what you pay attention to, how much time you spend reading stuff, watching stuff, what you click on, what you like, what you comment on, different interactions. We do it for our live show. Not very well, mind you, but we do it. Because they're trying to make money. Their job is not to inform you. It's not to make you into the person that God designed you to be, not to make you better and not to make the world better. It's to make them money. And they're really good at it. And they know that the best way to hold your attention, to get you to click on something, to get you to buy something, to get you to do something, is to scare the crap out of you and make you outraged. And it really works a lot. The article of that New York Times article that I was talking to you about, he closes up this article by proposing an additional SKU, something else, not just the making of the money and all of that stuff, but something else, another factor that he sees as playing into this mass bias towards bad news. And he finishes this article with these two paragraphs. And this is the guy that writes for the New York Times. I actually get his email every morning in my inbox. He finishes this article on the bias of bad news by saying this, quote, "In the modern era of journalism, dating roughly to the Vietnam and Watergate eras, we tend to equate impact with asking tough questions and exposing problems." He's talking about journalism. There are some good reasons for that. We're inundated by politicians and business executives, movie stars, and other people trying to portray themselves in the best light. Our job, the media's job, the journalist's job, is to cut through the self-promotion and find the truth. If we don't tell you the bad news, you may never hear it. Sometimes, though, our healthy skepticism can turn into reflexive cynicism. And we end up telling something less than the complete story. I'm grateful to Sacerdote, Cook, and Segal, the researchers, for doing to journalists what we normally do to others, holding up a mirror to our work and giving us a chance to do better. And he's right. This author, he points out the fact that media can be incredibly important and a very powerful tool for the public. It can expose all kinds of corruption and evil and violence and things that we need to know about so that we can make the world a better place. But as always, with a powerful tool, it can be very dangerous. Especially when it's giving us more of what we want. Especially when what we want can poison us with bitterness and with anxiety and with pessimism. Oh, he says, I know that the world can seem very grim. It can seem like this evil-filled place, and we need to hunker down and just protect ourselves and do our best to hold out until Jesus returns. And there's truth in that. There is truth in the reality that the world can be an evil place, and there are evil people. There are things and there are people that are worthy of being scared of. There are things that are happening all over the world that we should be outraged about. That we should see that and be a little bit fearful, a little more cautious. But there are far, far more good things, more beautiful things that are happening than what we're being told. There are things in our very city right now that are happening that I haven't heard about anywhere until I got a text from Mike Shields on Thursday night that said, hey, I've been invited to go down and walk through the new Union Gospel Mission building as they're getting close to opening, and I would love for you to come. And I was like, okay, let's do this. And so I showed up and got my hard hat and put my mask on and my little neon vest. It was looking really good, by the way. And we walked these brand new halls of this $13.5 million project that's right across the street to the west of the police station downtown. We walked these halls. We got to enter in through the doors where hundreds and hundreds of men and women are going to come and walk through those same doors and be loved on. We got to walk through the beautiful kitchen and this huge dining area that has the ability to feed 1,000 people every single meal. 1,000 people. We got to tour all 3 floors, the second and the third, where 300 men will be able to sleep for the night out of the rain and the wind and the snow and the ice. Somewhere that is clean and that is warm and that is safe. We got to see all of the rooms where they're going to be teaching and equipping and testing and doing GED stuff in partnership with Shemeketa. I mean, it was incredible. And we got to tour the brand new chapel where 300 men are going to be able to sit down in comfortable chairs and hear the gospel, some of them for the very first time. And they're going to be able to experience the hope and the renewal that comes from Jesus Christ alone that will radically transform their lives. And as we were standing in there, Mike and I, with the other 2 ladies that were with us and Dan, who's heading up the UGM right now, we got to hear the story from Chuck. You got to tell us his testimony. He's one of the guys, I think he might be the guy that is in charge of this entire $13.5 million building project. And he stood there and he talked to us about his own story of walking into UGM for the very first time, completely drunk, unable to contain alcoholism in his life, how it was destroying everything that he held dear, and how he sat in the very back and he heard the gospel for the first time and it transformed his life. And even though that was 20 years ago, it changed absolutely everything. And he began telling us about all of the thousands, literally thousands of men that he's got to walk through those doors of the old building, the cramped building, the building that's dirty and old and doesn't look like much, but how God has used that to transform the lives of thousands of men in our community. and to get them off the streets and to rebuild relationships and help them become the men that God designed them to be. And as we stood in this chapel and we're hearing Chuck's testimony and looking at the massive difference between the old building and this new beautiful building, and wondering aloud just how incredible it's going to be when God gets to open those doors and start doing amazing things in our community. I started thinking of just how weird it was that I hadn't really heard a whole lot about this, even though it's just blocks from where we're at right now. Two weeks ago, we finished our time in Paul's letter to the Philippians. And at the end of that series, I challenged you to fix your eyes on things above. The verse that I gave you was Philippians 4, 8, and 9. I want you to listen to what Paul says again, in light of what we've talked about tonight. I always find this weird tension when it comes to preparing a sermon. That there is this odd balance that every pastor gets to do, where you're trying to balance on one hand information and teaching, and on the other hand inspiration. You're trying to instill brand new knowledge that people didn't know before, and yet you're also trying to remind them of ancient truths that they might have forgotten. Tonight I was very heavy on, hopefully, what was new information. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe you're all aware of this, and that's fantastic. But in light of knowing about all of the info and all of the news and everything that we're being fed constantly, having this massive negative bent, not just because of what we're being fed, but because of what we're wanting to eat and fill our souls and our minds with, I want you to hear the words of the Apostle Paul again. This is Philippians 4, 8, and 9. And now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Keep putting into practice all you've learned and received from me, everything you heard from me and saw me doing, and then the God of peace will be with you. The point of this series is to purposefully and specifically look for things that God and the people of God are doing right now that are beautiful and honorable and lovely and pure. Things that build the kingdom of God. So over the next couple of weeks, we're gonna focus on some of those things, some of the things that have happened in the past that you might not have heard about, but are now affecting today. Things that are going on right now, both in our community and around the world, and then some things that are coming up in the very near future that have the potential to revolutionize life as we know it, especially life for those that are the most unfortunate, the ability for the playing field to get leveled just a little bit more. I'm going to do my best during this short little series to tie together the threads of God's movement through Scripture, through human history, and through what's going on right now in current events and new discoveries and technologies and healthcare stuff and societal changes that we're seeing. And my hope is that we're able to find a clearer view of what God has been doing and what God is doing and what God is going to be doing as we look into the future. You've probably heard the axiom that whatever you're looking for, you'll find it. I want to make sure that we're looking for the right things, that we're focusing on the right things, that we're spending our time and our energy and our thoughts on the right things so that we can find them because they're out there. May the people that we become, the people that we are, not just people who live lives of love and compassion, integrity and grace, but may we also be people who are looking for it, people who praise it when we see it, Because despite what you may have heard, it's not the end of the world as we know it.